Supposed biblical error. Did Jesus ride 2 donkeys into Jerusalem? In the Gospel of Matthew, it records that the disciples brought Jesus a donkey and its colt. They brought the donkey and the colt and put on them their cloaks, and he sat on them. Bart Ehrman, in Jesus Interrupted, highlights this passage and says, in Matthew, Jesus' disciples procured 2 animals for him, a donkey and a colt. They spread their garments over the 2 of them, and Jesus rode into town straddling them both. It is an odd image, but Matthew made Jesus fulfill the prophecy of Scripture quite literally. Popular anti-theists have also highlighted this issue to argue how ridiculous the Gospel of Matthew is, since it appears to have Jesus riding 2 animals. The rationale given is that Matthew is citing Zechariah 9:9, which contains a technique known as synonymous parallelism, where the text restates what is in the previous line, varying the words for emphasis or poetic reasons. The other Gospel authors were able to recognize this technique, but it is claimed that Matthew was confused and thought Zechariah said there were 2 animals. So because Matthew wanted to make sure Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament passage, he had to invent a second animal for Jesus to ride on. However, it's not like other scholars have not commented on this passage. To begin, the verse says, "They brought Jesus the donkey and the colt, and they put on them their cloaks, and he sat on them." The verse is vague, because the Greek word for them can refer to the cloaks laid on the colt and the donkey, or to the animals themselves. But any charitable reading would take it as a reference to Jesus sitting on the garments laid on the animals. Darrell Bach and David Turner say, the idea is probably that Jesus rode on the garments spread on the colt. Robert Gundry said, it is doubtful that Matthew intends his readers to visualize a trick rider balancing himself on 2 animals at the same time. Therefore, we are to think that the garments were draped over both animals, just as in modern Palestine, both mother donkeys and their unridden colts trotting after them have garments put across their backs. Though Jesus sat on top of the garments only on the colt, the association of the garmented mother makes a kind of wide throne. Craig Keener says, as in later Palestine, one would drape the garments on which Jesus sat across both the mother and the colt. Although Jesus would ride only one, the them on which he sat could mean the garments. R.T. France says, now 2 animals are brought to Jesus and prepared for riding, probably by the disciples using their own cloaks as saddlecloths. Assuming that he rode only one animal, the presence of the other is probably best explained at the narrative level by the comment of Mark and Luke that the foal had not been ridden before, so that its mother's presence would help it cope with a new experience and the frightening noise of the crowd. The festive occasion required that the mother, even though not ridden, should also be given a saddlecloth. In other words, given the festive nature of the event, it would be expected both animals would be covered in garments. The mother was there to keep the young colt calm. But employing the principle of charity, it should be expected that Jesus rode only one animal, while the other was beside Jesus with garments as well. So the verse refers to Jesus sitting on their cloaks, not on both animals. But D.W. Davies and Dale Allison object to this and say between the quote of Zechariah in verse 5 and the narrative in verse 7, there is perfect correspondence with the formula quotation. In other words, it appears as though Matthew is directly referencing back to the quote to say Jesus rode on the 2 animals mentioned in verse 5. So did Matthew misunderstand Zechariah 9:9? Did he misunderstand the passage, which is only about one animal, and assume there had to be 2 there? Gundry highlights the grammar and notes this is not actually a perfect correspondence, and suggests Matthew probably understood Zechariah was only talking about one animal. Even Davies and Allison are aware that Matthew gets the key section of the quote from the Hebrew and not merely from the Greek Septuagint. This is important because in the Hebrew passage Matthew knows about and quotes from, the Hebrew word for donkey is masculine. But in the narrative of verse 7, the word for donkey is presented with a feminine article. So between the quote and the narrative, there is not a perfect correspondence. Matthew seems aware that Zechariah was speaking about a male donkey, since it is clear in his narration the other animal was a female, breaking the direct link with the quoted passage. If Matthew thought there were 2 animals in the passage from Zechariah, he would have had to invent a second male donkey, instead of noting the other was the mother of the colt. So it seems unlikely Matthew is saying the Messiah rode both animals, but was prophesied to ride the young male. Furthermore, it is unlikely Matthew misunderstood the passage from Zechariah, given that scholars like Craig Keener and Robert Gundry note elsewhere throughout his gospel, he displays knowledge of Hebrew and comprehensive knowledge of the scriptures. Even in this passage, Matthew translates from the Hebrew more literally than the Septuagint does, demonstrating, as Gundry notes, he had access to the passage in Hebrew. Similarly, Bernard Batto notes that the evangelist did not understand the intended parallelism of the prophetic text seems highly unlikely, however. Already in the verse alone, Matthew has twice felt free to omit one of the two members of parallel cola, daughter Zion, daughter Jerusalem, triumphant and victorious, humble and riding on a draft animal. Clearly Matthew understood Hebrew poetic parallelism. Given that the other Gospels note the colt was young and no one had sat on it, it seems the reason Matthew mentioned the mother was brought along was to help keep the young male calm. So Gundry can conclude, it is therefore not unreasonable to suppose Matthew was working with a genuinely historical tradition. Matthew emphasizes the presence of the mother animal not to equate her with the masculine donkey in the quotation, but to underscore that the young donkey really was, as Mark said, unused. In other words, Matthew notes the mother was brought along to emphasize the youth of the colt, which the other Gospels speak of, not because he thought there were two animals in Zechariah 9:9 that Jesus had to ride on. But why even mention the mother was brought along at all? The other Gospels didn't feel the need to do this. Instead, they simplify the account to avoid any confusion. Well, Matthew might have included the second animal, so he could thereby include hidden meaning in the text that demonstrated Jesus was God and the fulfillment of prophecy. First, Davies and Allison note there may be a special theological purpose in there being two animals present, by drawing to passages from the Old Testament. 2 Samuel 16:1-2 says there were two donkeys presented for the household of King David. Habakkuk 3:2 in the Septuagint says the Lord will be known between two creatures. Some rabbis of the day ignored the rules of poetry in favor of excessively literal interpretation, and they did find two animals in Zechariah 9:9, which adds to the idea that some of Matthew's Jewish audience may have been looking for two animals. Rabbinic Judaism also taught the Messiah would be similar to Moses in many ways, and utilized Exodus 4:19-20, where it says Moses utilized a donkey to return to Egypt. Throughout his gospel, Matthew tries to paint Jesus as another Moses to illustrate Jesus as the Messiah. In the Septuagint, Exodus 4 uses a plural form of the word for donkey. Thus, to continue his theme of connecting Jesus to Moses, and given there were other Old Testament passages where the household of David and God himself were connected to two animals, Matthew could easily connect Jesus to David, Moses, and Yahweh by noting Jesus entered Jerusalem with two donkeys. Given that Matthew was specifically writing to a Jewish audience and relied on numerous quotes and allusions from the Old Testament, this was another connection his Jewish audience would have understood and have been able to pick up on. Second, Bernard Batto notes Matthew's use of two donkeys would also highlight Jesus' divinity and humility. Batto looked at the wider ancient Near Eastern context and found that in numerous depictions, deities were often presented on top of two animals or on a throne carried by animals. In the Old Testament, Yahweh is often presented as on a throne carried by living creatures. But in the ancient Near East, being on a donkey would also imply deference and humility. So Batto points out Matthew is painting a picture of Jesus sitting on a throne carried by two humble animals, which would both display his humility and divinity. This is in line with what Gundry had to say. Though Jesus sat on top of the garments only on the colt, the association of the garmented mother makes a kind of wide throne. Indeed, widening the throne to play up Jesus' royal majesty appears to underlie Matthew's importation of a second animal. Thus, we can begin to see what Matthew is doing in verse 7. Jesus deliberately enacted the prophecy of Zechariah 9:9, which spoke of a king who comes into Jerusalem riding on a donkey. But the garments were spread on the two animals, which represents a throne, and Jesus sat on the throne, even though it was only the male donkey he rode in on. The additional animal helped to represent the throne of Yahweh, carried by living creatures. Notice right after this in Matthew 21, Jesus enters the temple in Jerusalem and cleanses it, which creates a larger theme of Yahweh returning to the temple on a throne of living creatures to cleanse and renew it. Thus Bato says, Matthew merely wished to suggest to the reader that Jesus was mounted above the donkeys in a manner reminiscent of a deity mounted above his symbolic mount, much like Yahweh mounted above the cherubs. In Jesus' case, however, the mounts have a further symbolic connotation, namely the humbleness of the rider. Through it, Matthew was able to retain the Israelite tradition of the deity being born by two symbolic creatures, while also maintaining the thrust of Zechariah, that the Messiah would be a humble royal figure riding upon lowly donkeys, and perhaps echoing a long-standing tradition of the region as well. One theme of Matthew is that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. The theme is presented at the beginning of his gospel, throughout, and at his conclusion. The triumphant entry was another opportunity for Matthew to proclaim that Jesus was God in the flesh. He presented Jesus on a throne of garments carried by two animals, which was an ancient Near Eastern and biblical theme. So in reality, when we look at the linguistic and cultural context, the passage doesn't point to the idea that Matthew made an error. Instead, it suggests a deep understanding of the scriptures and the cultural context. Matthew specifically is trying to write in a way that will tell his readers Jesus rode on a throne of garments carried by two animals, which would have been understood in the cultural context to be a declaration of his divinity. At the end of the day, any charitable reading of the text would be that Matthew is saying Jesus sat on the garments, not straddling both animals. Yet why is it for some skeptics the principle of charity cannot be applied when it comes to the biblical text? In reality, only a surface-level reading of the text would suggest there might be an error. But a deeper understanding of the scriptures, the linguistics, and the cultural context suggests Matthew is doing something more interesting in his gospel, and has a far better understanding of the Hebrew text than most skeptics do. There really isn't an error unless we force the text into a simplistic and uncharitable reading. Thus, this supposed error can be resolved.